Every clock inside Black Veil Mountain stopped at exactly 2:17 a.m., the night 8 people died on the cable line. 11 years later, nobody in town will go near the mountain after dark. A broke veteran named Caleb Turner took the night watch job because he had nowhere else left to go. Before leaving, the station manager gave him one warning. After 2 a.m., do not leave the control room. Then Caleb's German Shepherd, Ghost, started growling at a strange humming sound deep inside the frozen mountain. At exactly 2:17 a.m., a dead cable cabin suddenly lit up through the blizzard. And when Caleb looked through his binoculars, he saw a man standing inside the cabin staring back at him. The next morning, Ghost dug a frozen employee badge out of the snow belonging to a man who officially died 11 years earlier. May peace and strength stay with you tonight. And if you enjoy stories of mystery, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe and join our journey. Snow drifted across the frozen roads of Wyoming as another storm rolled slowly over Black Veil Mountain. The abandoned cable line disappeared into the white fog above the cliffs, and the old resort lights below the mountain had long since gone dark. Caleb Turner drove the final miles in silence. The old Ford pickup groaned every time the tires hit frozen ruts in the road, its rusted frame shaking beneath the bitter wind. Snow gathered along the edges of the windshield, while the heater pushed out uneven warmth that smelled faintly of dust and old engine oil. Beside him sat Ghost, a large German Shepherd with a thick black and yellow coat, upright ears, and alert amber-brown eyes that constantly scanned the darkness ahead. The dog's broad chest rose steadily with each breath, calm but watchful, like a soldier who had never truly left duty behind. Caleb rested one rough hand on the steering wheel. At 48 years old, he still carried the hard frame of a military engineer. His shoulders were broad beneath a green and black plaid flannel jacket worn over a faded thermal shirt. Black jeans disappeared into worn brown leather boots stained with old snow and oil. A short, dark beard covered his square jaw, streaked lightly with gray near the chin, while cold winter light sharpened the tired lines around his steel blue eyes. Years of harsh weather and harder work had left their mark on him, but the deepest exhaustion sat somewhere behind his gaze. Caleb had spent too many years drifting between temporary jobs, sleeping in parking lots, repairing broken generators for strangers who forgot his name the moment they paid him. The mountain ahead looked no different from the others he had worked near during rescue operations years ago. But something about Black Veil felt wrong. Not dangerous. Quiet. Too quiet. Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the mountain ridge where the old cable line disappeared into blowing snow. A low growl rumbled softly in his throat. Caleb glanced sideways. Easy, boy. The dog did not relax. 15 minutes later, the truck rolled into the nearly abandoned town beneath the mountain. Most storefronts were dark except for a diner near the gas station, where warm yellow light spilled onto the snow. A few people stood outside smoking beneath the awning, but conversations stopped when Caleb's truck passed. Nobody smiled. Nobody waved. One older man near the gas pump lowered his eyes the moment Black Veil Mountain became visible behind Caleb's truck. Caleb noticed. People avoided looking upward, as if the mountain itself could look back. The cable station sat another mile uphill from town. Rusted fences surrounded the property, half buried beneath snowdrifts. Several cabins had been removed from the line years ago, leaving empty steel hangars swaying gently in the wind. The remaining cabins hung motionless over the cliffs like forgotten coffins. Ghost stepped out first when Caleb parked. Snow crunched beneath the dog's paws as he slowly circled the station yard. His ears twitched constantly, listening. The station doors opened before Caleb reached them. A tall man in his early 60s stepped outside carrying a flashlight and a ring of keys. His name tag identified him as Walter Grady. He had the lean build of someone hardened by mountain winters, with pale skin weathered by cold wind and a deeply lined face partially hidden beneath a gray beard. His heavy brown coat smelled faintly of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke. Thick white eyebrows shadowed sharp blue eyes that looked permanently tired. "You're Turner?" the man asked. Caleb nodded once. Walter glanced down at Ghost. "Big dog." "Used to work avalanche rescue," Caleb replied. Walter studied the German Shepherd for another second before stepping aside. "Good. Dogs notice things up here." The sentence lingered awkwardly in the air. Inside, the station smelled like cold metal, mildew, and old electrical wiring. Dust covered the ticket counters. Several overhead lights flickered weakly, despite the building supposedly running on backup power alone. Walter led Caleb toward the control room upstairs. "Most systems are shut down. Generators only keep the essentials alive." He handed Caleb a clipboard without much interest. "You check the monitors every hour. Walk the lower station perimeter twice a night. That's it." "Seems like a lot of money for security work," Caleb said quietly. Walter stopped walking. For a brief moment, silence filled the hallway except for the wind pressing against the windows. Then Walter continued moving again. "Nobody wants the job." That answer told Caleb enough. The control room overlooked the frozen mountain through massive glass windows coated in ice around the edges. Old monitors lined the walls beside outdated radio equipment and control panels no longer connected to active cabins. Ghost entered slowly behind Caleb. The dog froze. His ears lifted sharply toward the mountain outside. Then Caleb noticed it too. Every clock in the room had stopped at exactly 2:17. Wall clocks, digital clocks, even the old wristwatch hanging beside the monitor board. 2:17. Every single one. Caleb frowned. "Power surge?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, the older man walked toward the radio desk and lit a cigarette with slightly trembling fingers. Finally, he spoke. "Night of the collapse. 11 years ago." Caleb looked back toward the clocks. 8 people had died when one of the cabins snapped free during a blizzard. He remembered hearing about it years ago while still working disaster recovery contracts. Cable failure. Frozen supports. No survivors. At least that was the official story. Walter exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Most folks in town stopped coming up here after that winter. Then why keep the station running? Walter stared out toward the dark cable line disappearing into the mountain fog. "Investors want the place reopened next year." Ghost suddenly growled again. Low. Uneasy. The dog moved toward the windows overlooking the upper line. Walter noticed immediately. A strange expression crossed the older man's face. "Does he always do that?" "Only when something bothers him." Walter crushed the cigarette into an old coffee cup. "Keep him inside after 2 a.m. Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly. "Why?" Walter grabbed his coat from the chair near the door. Then he spoke the sentence Caleb would replay in his head for the rest of the night. "After 2 a.m., Walter paused. "Don't leave the control room." The older man walked out before Caleb could ask anything else. Outside, snow continued falling harder. Ghost remained beside the windows, watching the mountain. Hours passed slowly. Caleb completed paperwork, checked dead security feeds, and inspected the lower perimeter once before midnight. The deeper night grew, the stranger the station felt. Sometimes the lights dimmed without warning. Sometimes the radio hissed with bursts of static, even though nobody should have been transmitting. At 1:43 a.m., Ghost abruptly stood from the floor. The German Shepherd walked toward the control room windows and stared into the storm. A faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the darkness. Metal, humming, almost musical. Caleb slowly removed the binoculars hanging beside the monitors and stepped closer to the glass. The humming grew louder. Not mechanical, not exactly. It sounded like steel cables vibrating deep beneath layers of ice and wind. Ghost's ears locked forward. The dog gave another low growl. Then every light in the control room flickered once. The digital clock on one dead monitor suddenly flashed alive. 2:17 a.m. At that exact moment, movement appeared far out on the cable line. Cabin number 9. The abandoned cabin hanging near the upper cliffs trembled lightly against the wind. Then the red emergency light above its door blinked once, twice, 3 times. Caleb felt cold crawl slowly up his spine. That's impossible. The cabin had no power. The line had been dead for 11 years. Ghost barked sharply. Caleb raised the binoculars with steady hands. Snow swirled violently around the cabin, making visibility nearly impossible. But for one brief second, between shifting curtains of white, he saw a figure standing motionless inside cabin number 9. A man. Tall, still, watching the station, watching him. Then the storm swallowed the cabin again. Caleb lowered the binoculars slowly. Behind him, every clock in the control room remained frozen at 2:17, and somewhere deep inside Black Veil Mountain, the humming sound continued singing through the dark. Morning came slowly to Black Veil Mountain. Pale winter sunlight struggled through heavy clouds while freezing wind swept across the empty resort like something searching for movement. The storm from the night before had eased, but the mountain still felt restless beneath the silence. Caleb Turner had barely slept. The image inside cabin number 9 replayed in his head every time he closed his eyes. The figure standing motionless behind the frosted glass. Watching him. Waiting. He stood near the control room window with a steaming cup of stale coffee warming his hands. His green and black plaid flannel jacket hung open over a dark thermal shirt, revealing the heavy build he still carried from years of military labor. Morning light sharpened the rough edges of his face, the gray threading through his short dark hair, and the exhaustion sitting beneath his pale blue eyes. Ghost stood beside the door. The German Shepherd had remained unusually alert since dawn. His black and yellow coat looked almost silver where sunlight touched the fur along his shoulders. Every few seconds his ears twitched toward the upper mountain, listening again. Caleb finally grabbed his gloves and flashlight. Come on. Ghost immediately moved first. Outside, fresh snow cracked beneath their boots and paws as they crossed the frozen station yard. Wind pushed loose powder across the ground in thin, ghostly waves. Above them, the old cable line disappeared into drifting fog. Ghost ignored the main trail. Instead, the dog walked directly toward the maintenance road leading to tower number 4. Caleb frowned slightly. That was the tower, the one that had collapsed 11 years ago. The steel support rose from the cliffs like a giant skeleton half buried in ice. Rust covered parts of the lower structure where repairs had never been completed. Bent warning signs still clung to the fencing nearby. Ghost slowed near the base of the tower, Then he started digging. Snow flew behind him as his large paws clawed through the frozen surface with focused urgency. Caleb stepped closer and crouched beside the dog. Something metal appeared beneath the ice. Caleb pulled it free carefully. An employee badge. The photograph was faded, but still visible beneath scratches and water damage. The man in the photo looked around 50, lean-faced with tired eyes and dark hair streaked heavily with gray. His beard was short and uneven, like someone who cared more about surviving winter than appearance. Across the bottom of the card were the words, Mason Reed, Senior Safety Engineer. Caleb stared at it silently. Then Ghost growled softly toward the mountain again. Back inside the station, Caleb spent nearly 2 hours digging through old digital files on the office computer system. Most records from Black Veil Resort were badly organized or partially corrupted. Several folders from the year of the disaster had been deleted entirely. But Caleb noticed something strange. The deletion dates were recent. Not 11 years old. Recent. Someone had manually cleaned parts of the archive only a few months ago. He searched employee rosters again. No Mason Reed. No engineer matching the photo. Nothing. Which made no sense. A senior safety engineer could not simply disappear from every company record unless someone wanted him erased. Ghost lay beside the desk while Caleb continued searching. The dog's amber-brown eyes followed every movement on the monitors as if he understood the tension building in the room. Around noon, Caleb drove into town. Brightwater looked different during daylight. The fear hiding beneath the town became easier to see now. Several storefronts sat permanently closed. Old motel signs creaked in the wind. Even the people walking along Main Street moved quietly, avoiding conversations about the mountain looming above them. Caleb entered the diner near the gas station. Warm air carrying the smell of coffee, fried bacon, and cinnamon hit him immediately. The place was small but crowded with old photographs of fishing seasons, hunting trips, and Black Veil Mountain before the disaster. A woman behind the counter looked up as Caleb entered. She appeared to be in her late 60s, with sturdy shoulders and thick silver hair tied loosely behind her head. Her face carried deep smile lines, though her gray eyes looked sharper than her warm voice suggested. She wore a faded blue sweater beneath a flour-stained apron and moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades caring for people, whether they deserved it or not. "Mountain Station?" she asked immediately. Caleb nodded once. "I'm Agnes Holloway," she said, while pouring coffee into a mug without asking. "Most folks just call me Aggie." Ghost settled beside Caleb's booth while several customers quietly glanced toward the dog. "He's beautiful," Agnes said softly. "Military? Rescue dog?" Ghost lifted his head slightly when she spoke to him, but remained calm. Agnes placed the coffee down carefully. "You should leave that mountain before winter settles in fully." Caleb studied her face. Why does everybody say that without actually saying anything? The diner grew quieter. Agnes looked toward the window where Black Veil Mountain rose above the town. Then she lowered her voice. "People hear things up there." Caleb said nothing. Agnes leaned closer. After the collapse, some rescue crews claimed they heard the cables singing in the storm before Tower 4 snapped. Ghost suddenly raised his head, as if he recognized the sentence. Agnes noticed. The older woman's expression changed slightly. "That dog hears it too, doesn't he?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded once. For several seconds, Agnes simply stared toward Ghost. Not afraid. More like someone remembering something unpleasant. Before Caleb could ask another question, the diner door opened. Walter Grady entered carrying snow on his coat shoulders. He looked even older in daylight, his pale skin roughened by cold wind and sleepless nights. The moment he saw Caleb holding the employee badge, the color drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" "Tower 4. Walter grabbed the badge too quickly. His hands trembled. "You shouldn't dig around that mountain." "Who's Mason Reed?" Walter looked toward the other customers. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked up from their meals. Finally, Walter handed the badge back slowly. There was no Mason Reed. "That's not what the badge says." Walter's jaw tightened beneath his gray beard. "Forget the name." Then he walked back out into the snow without touching the coffee Agnes had already poured for him. Caleb watched through the window as the old man lit a cigarette with shaking fingers beside his truck. Fear. Real fear. That bothered Caleb more than the story itself. Night returned early over Black Veil Mountain. The storm rolled back heavier than before, covering the cliffs in white darkness. Wind screamed against the station windows while the old radio hissed with random bursts of static. At 1:38 a.m., Ghost abruptly stood. The German shepherd's entire body stiffened. His ears locked toward the upper cable line. Then he bolted from the room. "Ghost!" The dog disappeared down the stairwell before Caleb could stop him. Caleb grabbed his flashlight and rushed after him into the storm. Snow hammered against his face as he followed Ghost's tracks uphill toward the upper ridge. Wind howled through the hanging cables overhead, creating that same strange humming sound from the night before. The Singing Mountain. The phrase from Agnes repeated inside Caleb's head. Ghost climbed fast through the drifts, never hesitating once. Finally, Caleb saw it. Cabin number 9, hanging motionless near the upper ridge station. Its red emergency light glowed faintly through the storm. Ghost reached the platform first and barked sharply. Caleb forced the frozen cabin door open. Inside, cold air rushed past him, carrying the smell of cedar smoke. Not old smoke. Fresh. A small iron stove near the back wall still contained warm ashes beneath blackened wood. Several canned food containers sat beside a folded wool blanket. A military-style radio rested near the window, connected to a battery system built from scavenged parts. Someone had been living here. Recently. Caleb's pulse slowed into the calm focus he used to feel during military rescue operations. He studied the floor carefully. Boot prints. Fresh. One set only. Ghost moved toward the far wall and growled low in his throat. Caleb raised the flashlight. Words had been carved repeatedly into the wooden wall using a knife. He didn't die here. Over and over. Deep enough to splinter the wood. Caleb stepped closer. Then Ghost suddenly spun toward the window. The dog's growl deepened instantly. Caleb turned. At first he saw only snow. Then a shape emerged beyond the frosted glass. A tall man standing motionless outside the cabin. Long dark coat, gray beard. Watching them. The figure remained there only a few seconds. Then the storm swallowed him whole. Caleb rushed outside with the flashlight sweeping across the blizzard. Nothing. No sound, except the wind and the humming cables above the cliffs. But down below in the snow, he found fresh footprints leading deeper into Black Veil Mountain. And for the first time since arriving, Caleb realized the truth frightened him less than the possibility that someone had spent 11 years waiting for another human being to finally follow those tracks. The storm lingered over Black Veil Mountain for 2 more days. Wind hammered the cliffs almost non-stop, while fresh snow buried the upper roads deep enough to trap smaller vehicles beneath the drifts. Most of the town stayed indoors from Pons after sunset now. Even the diner closed early. The mountain seemed to press its shadow over everything below it. Caleb Turner barely noticed the passing time. Since finding the footprints outside cabin number 9, his entire focus had narrowed toward one thing: Mason Reed. The name sat in his head like a splinter. Every missing file, every nervous glance from Walter, every strange sound Ghost reacted to before anyone else. It all circled back to the same man. The control room had become Caleb's workshop. Old maintenance manuals, dusty hard drives, printed accident reports, and electrical diagrams covered nearly every surface. Several monitors flickered weakly, while extension cables stretched across the floor toward an old military-grade laptop Caleb kept in his truck for repair jobs. Ghost rested beneath the window overlooking the mountain. But even asleep, the German shepherd's ears moved constantly. Listening. Caleb sat hunched over the keyboard in his green and black plaid flannel jacket, dark stubble shadowing his jaw more heavily now, after days without proper sleep. His rough hands moved steadily across the controls, while old surveillance files slowly rebuilt themselves sector by sector. Years ago in Afghanistan, Caleb had worked beside communications specialists, restoring damaged systems after roadside explosions destroyed infrastructure. Compared to military encryption, Black Veil's outdated security network felt primitive, which made the deleted files even more suspicious. Someone had erased them carefully, not sloppily. At 11:14 p.m., Caleb finally accessed a hidden archive buried beneath maintenance reports. A folder appeared. BVM Structural Reports. Restricted. Caleb opened the files. Ghost immediately lifted his head. The humming sound had returned somewhere deep beneath the mountain. Soft, metallic, almost like distant singing through frozen pipes. Caleb ignored it for the moment and focused on the reports. The first document stopped him cold. Author: Mason Reed. Lead structural safety engineer, so Walter had lied. Mason Reed had not only existed, he had been the chief safety engineer responsible for the entire cable line. Caleb opened the reports one after another. His expression hardened with every page. 3 days before the disaster, Mason documented dangerous harmonic vibrations inside the upper cable system. According to his notes, shifting ice beneath the mountain was causing subtle movement in Tower Number 4. The vibration transferred uneven stress across the main load-bearing cable during high wind conditions. One report contained a sentence highlighted in red: "Immediate shutdown recommended before catastrophic structural failure occurs." Caleb leaned back slowly. The next report was worse. Mason warned that emergency brake systems were also malfunctioning during heavy ice accumulation. Under the right conditions, a snapped tower could drag multiple cabins off the line before the secondary brakes activated. 8 people. The number suddenly felt much heavier. Ghost stood now. The dog stared directly toward the floor beneath the control room. Then came another sound. A low metallic vibration. Longer this time. Caleb muted the monitors. The humming remained. Not electrical. Not machinery. Something underneath them. Ghost gave a short bark. Caleb grabbed his flashlight. "Show me." The German shepherd immediately moved toward the lower maintenance corridor behind the station. Caleb followed through narrow concrete hallways coated with dust and rust stains. Most doors downstairs had been chained shut years earlier, but Ghost stopped beside an old service elevator near the rear wall. The dog sniffed along the floor intensely. then pawed once against loose metal grating. Caleb crouched beside it. Cold air drifted upward through the gaps. A tunnel. Using a crowbar from the maintenance rack, Caleb forced the grating aside and revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness beneath the station. The humming grew louder immediately. Ghost went first. The tunnel smelled like diesel fuel, wet stone, and old machinery. Thick electrical cables lined the walls while ancient warning signs hung crooked from rusted bolts. Water dripped somewhere deeper underground. Caleb's flashlight swept across abandoned generators and tool benches left untouched for years. Except they had not been untouched. Fresh footprints marked the dust. Someone had been here recently. Ghost paused beside a large diesel generator at the end of the chamber. The machine was warm. Caleb touched the metal casing with narrowed eyes. Fuel line recently replaced. Oil recently changed. Someone was keeping the underground systems alive. Then the overhead lights flickered once. Ghost growled softly. Several monitors mounted near the far wall suddenly activated for a few seconds before shutting off again. Enough time for Caleb to see static-covered security footage from the upper mountain. The system was still receiving power every night. At exactly 2:17. Caleb moved deeper into the tunnel. He discovered shelves packed with engineering journals, handwritten diagrams, and maintenance logs dating back more than a decade. Dust covered most surfaces, but several books looked recently moved. Ghost stopped near a steel locker against the wall. Inside, Caleb found an old leather notebook. Mason Reed's journal. The handwriting inside was tight, rushed, and increasingly unstable as the dates approached the disaster. Caleb read carefully. The mountain sings before every major ice shift. The vibrations are worsening. They think I'm paranoid. No one listens unless prophets disappear. Then another line. Ghost would hear it. Caleb froze. He looked toward his dog. Ghost stared back calmly. Mason had known a rescue dog before? Or had he worked with avalanche teams? Caleb turned more pages. The final entries became desperate. The cables are no longer stable. Tower 4 foundation shifting faster. If they run the holiday line tomorrow, people will die. The final sentence on the last page looked carved into the paper itself. Daniel won't stop the launch. Caleb's jaw tightened. Daniel. No last name, but someone important enough to overrule safety shutdowns. Suddenly, the rescue radio near the far wall crackled alive. Static exploded through the tunnel. Ghost instantly snapped toward it. Then through the noise came a faint voice. Distorted. Broken. Line down. The signal died immediately. Caleb stepped closer to the old communication equipment. Several cables connected the radio system to a damaged surveillance server sitting beneath the desk. His pulse slowed into cold concentration. If the radios still worked, the camera backups might still exist too. It took him nearly 3 hours to restore partial power using the underground generator. Ghost remained beside the tunnel entrance most of the time, listening toward the mountain above them, while Caleb rebuilt corrupted surveillance files sector by sector. At 3:42 a.m., one monitor finally displayed recovered footage. Black and white security video from 11 years earlier. Snow hammered the camera lens outside the upper station, while tourists moved through the terminal, wearing winter coats and ski gear. Employees rushed between control panels preparing the holiday launch. Then a man entered the frame. Mason Reed. Younger than the photograph on the badge. Taller than Caleb expected too, with sharp shoulders beneath a heavy work coat and dark hair hanging messily around a weathered face. Even through the grainy footage, exhaustion showed in his movements. Mason argued violently with another man near the loading gate. The second man looked younger, maybe early 30s, athletic build, expensive winter jacket. His face remained partially obscured by camera distortion. The argument escalated quickly. Mason grabbed the younger man's arm and pointed toward the tower line outside. The younger man shoved him back. Then something unexpected happened. The younger man punched Mason first. Ghost stood suddenly. The dog's fur bristled along his neck. On screen, Mason fought back hard. The two men crashed into the control railing, while employees nearby tried pulling them apart. Then Mason broke free and sprinted toward the emergency control room. The younger man shouted something after him. Caleb leaned closer. The video had no audio, but the fear on both men's faces felt unmistakably real. Mason reached the control room door, then froze. The door would not open. He pounded against it repeatedly. Locked. The younger man stopped several feet behind him. Not angry anymore. Terrified. Then the footage glitched violently. Static swallowed the screen. When the image returned, the upper cable line outside shook violently through the blizzard. One of the towers tilted. Then the recording ended. Silence filled the underground chamber. Only the low humming inside the mountain remained. Caleb stared at the black monitor for a long time. Everything felt different now. Until this moment, Mason Reed had seemed like a victim, a ghost hiding from some forgotten conspiracy. But the footage changed things. Why was Mason fighting that man? Why had someone locked the control room? And why had the younger man looked terrified after realizing the door was sealed? Ghost slowly approached the monitor. The German Shepherd stared at Mason's frozen image on the screen. Then the dog lowered his head slightly. Not growling, not aggressive, almost uncertain. For the first time since arriving at Black Veil Mountain, Caleb wondered if Mason Reed had truly been trying to save lives that night, or if the mountain had hidden a much darker truth beneath the snow all these years. The blizzard arrived before dawn. Snow slammed against Black Veil Mountain, with enough force to shake the station windows, while freezing wind screamed through the hanging cable line overhead. Visibility dropped to almost nothing beyond the lower towers. The entire mountain seemed swallowed by moving white darkness. Caleb Turner had not slept. The restored surveillance footage kept replaying in his mind. Mason fighting the younger man. The locked control room. The panic spreading across both their faces seconds before disaster struck. Nothing about it felt simple anymore. Ghost stood beside the control room windows long before sunrise, staring toward the forest above the upper ridge. The German Shepherd's black and yellow fur bristled slightly each time the mountain groaned beneath the storm. Then suddenly, Ghost ran. The dog bolted from the room so fast his claws scraped loudly across the floor. Ghost! Caleb grabbed his flashlight and heavy coat before rushing after him into the blizzard. Outside, the cold hit like broken glass against exposed skin. Snow whipped violently through the air, while the upper cable line groaned somewhere beyond visibility. Ghost's tracks cut sharply away from the maintenance road and disappeared into the pine forest above the cliffs. Caleb followed. Branches bent heavily beneath snow overhead, while the wind pushed through the trees with a low, hollow whistle. The deeper he climbed into the forest, the stranger the mountain sounded. Beneath the storm, Caleb could still hear it faintly. That humming, the singing mountain. Ghost moved fast, but never out of sight completely. Every few moments, the German Shepherd stopped ahead between the trees, checking that Caleb still followed before continuing deeper into the wilderness. Then Caleb saw smoke. Thin gray smoke drifting upward through the snowstorm. A cabin stood hidden among the pines near the edge of a frozen ravine. It was old and narrow, built from dark timber almost black with age. Snow buried half the structure, and the roof sagged slightly beneath years of winter storms. One dim lantern glowed faintly behind frost-covered windows. Ghost stopped outside the door. No barking, no aggression, only silence. Caleb approached carefully. Then the cabin door opened. A shotgun appeared first. The man holding it looked older than the surveillance footage by at least 20 years. Mason Reed stood tall but painfully thin beneath layers of heavy wool clothing. His dark beard had turned almost completely gray now, hanging unevenly around a hollow face sharpened by isolation and exhaustion. Deep lines carved through his pale skin, while dark circles beneath his eyes suggested someone who barely slept anymore. His long hair fell messily around his shoulders, as though he had stopped caring how the world saw him years ago. But his eyes remained sharp, constantly moving, watching everything, especially the tree line behind Caleb. Ghost slowly walked past Caleb and entered the cabin first. Mason lowered the shotgun immediately. "You shouldn't have followed him," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough from disuse. Caleb stepped inside. Warm air carrying the smell of cedar smoke, coffee, and old paper filled the cabin. The inside looked less like a home and more like a bunker built by someone preparing for the end of the world. Radios lined the shelves beside stacked canned food, engineering journals, weather maps, and batteries. Several rifles leaned near the fireplace, all carefully maintained. Mason noticed Caleb studying the equipment. "You learn to stay prepared when people spend years hunting for you." Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly. "Who?" Mason stared toward the storm outside before answering. "Daniel Voss." The name settled heavily in the room. Ghost curled near the fireplace but kept watching Mason carefully. Not hostile, curious. Mason noticed that too. "He trusts people better than you do," he muttered. Caleb removed his snow-covered gloves slowly. "Maybe he hears things I don't." For the first time, a faint expression crossed Mason's face. Not quite a smile, something sadder. He always did. The cabin lights flickered briefly as wind battered the trees outside. Caleb studied Mason carefully now. Up close, the man looked deeply damaged in ways that had nothing to do with age. His hands trembled slightly whenever sudden noises echoed outside. Every few minutes, his eyes darted toward the radios beside the wall. A lifetime of tension sat inside him, like a wound that never healed. Then an engine sound echoed faintly somewhere down the mountain. Mason froze instantly. The reaction happened before he could hide it. His breathing sharpened. His grip tightened around the shotgun, hard enough for the knuckles to pale. Ghost immediately stood. Mason looked embarrassed a few seconds later, lowering the weapon slowly. "They used snowmobiles back then," he said quietly. "Searching the woods." Caleb understood. Military trauma recognized military trauma. Different wars, same ghosts. The cabin door opened again nearly an hour later. An older man stepped inside carrying firewood. Caleb recognized him immediately. Walter Grady. The station caretaker stopped cold when he saw Caleb standing near the fireplace. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Walter sighed heavily beneath his gray beard. "Guess secrets don't stay buried forever." Behind him came Agnes Holloway carrying 2 canvas bags filled with food supplies. Snow dusted the shoulders of her heavy blue winter coat, while loose silver hair escaped from beneath her knitted cap. Despite her age, she moved with stubborn strength. the kind built through decades, surviving harsh winters and harder losses. "You finally found him," she said softly to Caleb. Mason looked irritated. "I didn't need finding." Agnes ignored him completely. "You look terrible, Mason." "I always look terrible." A fourth figure entered last. Pastor Jeremiah Holt. He was a tall man in his early 70s with broad shoulders slightly bent by age and years spent working outdoors alongside his church community. A thick white beard framed his deeply lined face, while calm gray eyes carried the quiet patience of someone who had listened to people's pain most of his life. Beneath his long black winter coat hung a faded wool scarf knitted unevenly by hand years ago. Jeremiah closed the cabin door carefully behind him. Then he looked toward Caleb. "So," the pastor said quietly, "the mountain finally brought someone else here." The realization settled slowly inside Caleb. Mason had not survived alone. The town had protected him for 11 years. Walter placed the firewood beside the stove and finally spoke without looking directly at Caleb. After the collapse, Daniel Voss blamed Mason publicly for everything. Said he ignored warning signs. Said he panicked during evacuation. Mason laughed bitterly under his breath. Convenient story. Agnes unpacked canned food onto the shelves. 3 months later, 2 men started asking questions around town. Private security types, armed. Her expression darkened slightly. People figured Daniel wanted the last witness gone. Jeremiah nodded slowly near the fire. Fear spreads quickly in small towns, especially when money controls most of the mountain. Caleb crossed his arms beneath his green and black plaid flannel jacket. Then why hide all this? Mason looked directly into the flames before answering. Because 8 people died. The room fell silent. Mason walked slowly toward a small wooden desk near the wall. His movements carried exhaustion deeper than physical pain now. He opened a drawer. Inside sat dozens of sealed envelopes stacked carefully together. Every envelope contained handwritten names, families of the victims. Caleb stared quietly. "You wrote them letters?" Mason nodded once. "Every winter." "Why never send them?" Mason's tired eyes drifted toward the snow outside the cabin windows. "Because apologies don't resurrect people." Ghost approached him slowly. The German shepherd sniffed the envelopes gently before sitting beside Mason's chair. Mason rested one shaking hand against the dog's neck. "You know the worst part?" he asked quietly. Caleb said nothing. Mason reached into another drawer and removed a silver pocket watch scratched heavily along the edges. The watch had stopped permanently at 2:17. "Ethan Voss gave me this 3 days before the collapse." Caleb frowned slightly. "The man in the surveillance video?" Mason nodded. "He was Daniel's son." The words hit harder than Caleb expected. Mason stared down at the frozen watch in his palm. Ethan discovered the inspection reports. He realized his father ignored the shutdown warnings. Mason's jaw tightened beneath his beard. That night, he tried stopping the launch himself. The cabin remained completely silent except for the wind outside. Mason continued slowly. "We fought because I wanted him away from the loading area before panic spread through the station. Then we both ran for the control room." Caleb already knew what came next. The door was locked. Mason nodded once. Daniel locked it from outside. His voice cracked slightly now. He thought if the line stayed running a few more minutes, they could finish the holiday departures before shutting everything on. Agnes quietly lowered her eyes. Walter stared into the stove fire without speaking. Jeremiah removed his glasses slowly and rubbed one tired hand across his face. Mason looked suddenly much older. Those few minutes killed everyone. His fingers tightened around the pocket watch, including Ethan. The storm outside intensified again, shaking the cabin walls beneath another wave of mountain wind. Ghost lifted his head toward the sound. That humming returned faintly beneath the storm. The singing mountain. Mason heard it too. His expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. He stood and walked toward the frost-covered window. Then he spoke quietly without turning around. People think the mountain killed them. The humming deepened outside. Mason's tired eyes fixed somewhere beyond the blizzard. It didn't. The cables groaned softly through the storm. It warned us for hours. And standing there beside the shattered man who had spent 11 years hiding from the world, Caleb Turner finally realized Black Veil Mountain had never been silent at all. Everyone else had simply refused to listen. The storm finally weakened near sunrise. Gray light spread slowly across Black Veil Mountain, while thick fog drifted through the pine forest below Mason Reed's cabin. Snow still clung heavily to the branches, but for the first time in days, the mountain no longer sounded angry. It sounded tired. Caleb Turner stood outside near the frozen ravine, with both hands buried inside the pockets of his green and black plaid flannel jacket. Ghost sat beside him, watching pale morning light creep across the cliffs. The German shepherd's black and yellow coat moved gently beneath the cold wind, while his ears twitched toward distant sounds far below the mountain. Neither man nor dog had slept much. Mason's confession still lingered heavily inside Caleb's thoughts. Daniel Voss knowingly allowed the line to keep running, even after the warnings, even after his own son tried stopping it. 8 people died because of a few more minutes of profit. Caleb had seen greed kill before during military contracts overseas. Cheap materials, ignored warnings, civilians treated like numbers inside corporate reports. But something about Black Veil felt worse, because everyone here still lived beneath the shadow of that decision. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Mason stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He looked even more exhausted in daylight. His heavy gray beard moved slightly in the wind, while deep, sleepless shadows sat beneath his eyes. He wore an old green wool coat patched repeatedly at the elbows and shoulders. The kind of coat repaired so many times it no longer resembled the original fabric underneath. He handed Caleb one mug silently. For a while they simply stood there listening to the mountain. Then Mason finally spoke. "Daniel's selling the resort." Caleb looked over slowly. Mason stared down toward the distant cable station, barely visible through the fog. "Whole property, every acre, the investors are calling it a rebirth project." His voice carried bitter amusement. "Luxury ski village, new cable line, winter tourism expansion." Mason shook his head slowly. "Hundreds of millions involved." Caleb frowned. "That's why the station's running again." Mason nodded. "If the truth about the collapse comes out now, the deal dies instantly." He glanced toward Caleb. "And Daniel Voss loses everything." Ghost suddenly stood. The dog stared toward the lower forest, listening. Caleb noticed immediately. "What is it?" But Ghost relaxed again a few seconds later. False alarm. Mason watched the dog carefully. "He hears shifts before they happen." "You worked with rescue dogs before?" "Years ago." Mason took a slow sip of coffee. Avalanche teams sometimes trained near the mountain. The dogs always reacted before the cables started singing. Caleb looked toward Ghost again. The German Shepherd now sat calmly beside the cabin porch, though his eyes remained fixed toward Black Veil's upper ridge. Mason lowered his voice slightly. That mountain talks before it breaks. The sentence stayed with Caleb long after they returned to the station later that morning. Snow covered most of the lower access roads now, leaving the cable station isolated beneath the cliffs. Wind rattled the loose steel structures overhead, while frozen cabins swayed gently against the line. Inside the control room, Ghost immediately moved toward the far corner beside the old electrical cabinets. Then he stopped. The dog lowered his nose toward the wooden floorboards and sniffed intensely. Caleb crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Ghost pawed once against the floor. A hollow sound echoed underneath. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Using a crowbar from the maintenance room, he pried loose several warped boards beneath the cabinet. Hidden underneath sat a small steel safe coated in dust, but not old dust. Someone had opened it recently. Mason went pale the moment he saw it. "You never found that before?" Mason slowly shook his head. Caleb forced the safe open carefully. Inside were folders, dozens of them. The first folder stopped him cold. Caleb Turner, his full military record, sat inside. Army Engineering Service history, medical evaluations, PTSD treatment summaries, financial reports, employment history, even photographs. One photo showed Caleb years earlier sitting outside a veterans support center in Montana after losing another temporary job. Another showed him repairing generators behind a roadside mechanic shop in Nebraska. Caleb stared silently at the images. Someone had been tracking him for years. Ghost sensed the shift in his breathing immediately and moved closer beside him. Caleb looked toward Mason slowly. "You knew about this?" Mason hesitated too long, then finally nodded once. Anger flashed across Caleb's face instantly. "You set this up?" Mason stepped back slightly. "Listen to me first. You followed me?" "I watched veteran support programs," Mason answered quickly. "Homeless assistance records, temporary labor rosters, disaster relief work." Caleb's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "That's not an answer." Mason rubbed one trembling hand across his tired face before speaking again. "I needed someone who wouldn't run when the mountain started talking back." Silence filled the room. Outside, wind groaned through the frozen cables. Mason looked directly at Caleb now. "Only people who spend years pulling others out of danger understand what fear really sounds like." His voice softened slightly. "I read your rescue records. Afghanistan, Colorado floods, Wyoming avalanche recovery." Caleb said nothing. Mason continued. "You kept going back into places everyone else abandoned." Ghost rested his head lightly against Caleb's leg. Mason glanced toward the dog. "That's why I suggested your name." The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Caleb stared down at the rest of the files inside the safe. More reports, psych evaluations, debt history, isolation risk assessments. Some pages carried another signature. D. Voss. Caleb's stomach tightened instantly. Mason noticed. "Daniel agreed to hire you because he thought you'd be useful." "How?" "A broke veteran living out of his truck." Mason's tired eyes hardened. "No family, no support system, PTSD history." He paused. "Easy to manipulate, easy to blame if things went wrong." The words hit harder than Caleb expected, because part of him knew they were true. Men like Daniel Voss always looked for disposable people. Caleb had become disposable a long time ago. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Ghost abruptly lifted his head again. The dog stared toward the old radio system mounted near the control desk. A low burst of static crackled through the speakers. Mason froze instantly. The rescue radio had remained silent for nearly 12 hours. Now the speakers hissed loudly enough to echo across the room. Caleb stepped closer. Static surged violently through the signal. Then a voice emerged. Broken. Panicked. Old. "Shut the line down now!" Ghost barked sharply. Mason's face drained of color. The voice continued through bursts of interference. "Tower 4 is shifting." Static exploded. Then came another sound. Metal screaming. Not the mountain this time. Steel cables snapping apart somewhere inside the storm. The noise blasted through the speakers with horrifying clarity. Caleb physically flinched. Ghost growled deeply beside the desk. Then suddenly, silence. The radio died completely. Only the wind outside remained. Mason stared at the dead speakers, like a man seeing ghosts rise from the grave. "That was him," he whispered. Caleb looked over slowly. "Who?" Mason swallowed hard. "Ethan." The room fell completely still. Mason moved toward the radio with shaking hands. That transmission was recorded the night of the collapse. His breathing sharpened slightly now. "I heard it once before the line went down." Caleb stared toward the frozen mountain outside the control room windows. Somewhere beneath the snow and steel and silence, Black Veil Mountain still remembered that night. And now it was starting to speak again. 3 days later, Black Veil Mountain disappeared beneath another wall of snow. The weather reports called it the worst winter front in nearly 15 years. Winds from Canada were colliding with warm pressure systems moving east across Wyoming, creating a storm powerful enough to bury roads, collapse weak roofs, and shut down entire counties beneath ice. Caleb Turner stood outside the upper maintenance platform watching dark clouds swallow the mountain ridge. Something about the air felt wrong. Not just cold, heavy. The same pressure he remembered before avalanches back in Afghanistan, when unstable snowpacks groaned beneath the cliffs before collapsing without warning. Ghost felt it too. The German shepherd paced restlessly near the edge of the platform, his black and yellow coat rippling beneath sharp mountain wind. His ears twitched constantly toward the cable line overhead, while low, uneasy growls rose from deep inside his chest every time the steel cables vibrated against the towers. The singing mountain had grown louder each night, and now Caleb finally understood why. The resort investors had arrived that morning. 5 black SUVs sat near the lower station, while contractors moved through the property, carrying clipboards and equipment cases. Temporary floodlights illuminated the loading areas as crews prepared for reopening inspections before the official launch next winter. Black Veil was waking up again, and Caleb could already feel the mountain resisting it. Inside the lower maintenance building, old blueprints and modern engineering schematics covered an enormous table beneath fluorescent lights. Caleb leaned over them in his green and black plaid flannel jacket, rough fingers tracing the updated cable specifications while snow hammered against the windows outside. Mason stood nearby silently. He looked worse every day now that the mountain had become active again. Sleeplessness hollowed his face further, while anxiety constantly pulled his eyes toward every vibration in the building. Caleb finally spoke. "They changed the load ratios." Mason slowly nodded. They replaced the original steel composite bearings. Caleb pointed toward the updated tower diagrams. These supports are cheaper. 30% cheaper, Mason answered quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened beneath his dark beard. The redesigned system reduced overall weight costs by using lighter structural components around Tower 4, the exact same tower that failed 11 years earlier. Only now the mountain carried even more instability beneath the ice. Caleb flipped through additional reports. The numbers confirmed everything. The new design technically passed federal minimum safety standards, but barely. Not enough for storms like Black Veil. Not enough for harmonic vibration events. Not enough for a mountain that sang before it broke apart. They're repeating the same mistake, Caleb muttered. Mason stared toward the storm outside the window. Daniel Voss never cared about safety, only profit margins. Ghost suddenly barked sharply from the doorway. Both men turned. The dog stood completely rigid facing the upper cable line. Then the humming began again. Louder than before. The entire building vibrated faintly beneath their boots. Not enough for normal people to notice. But Caleb noticed now. Ghost bolted outside. Caleb followed immediately into the snowstorm. The upper line groaned violently overhead as powerful wind slammed across the mountain. Maintenance workers near Tower 2 looked increasingly nervous while checking emergency anchor systems. One of them approached Caleb quickly. His name tag read Owen Pierce. The younger man appeared around 30 years old, with broad shoulders, short blonde hair, and wind-burned skin darkened by years working mountain jobs. He wore heavy insulated coveralls stained with grease and carried himself with the exhausted alertness of someone used to dangerous labor. A faded wedding ring hung from a chain around his neck instead of his finger. "The upper line's vibrating again," Owen shouted above the wind. "How bad?" Owen hesitated. "Worse than yesterday." Ghost growled toward the cliffs, then suddenly sprinted downhill toward the eastern maintenance trail. Caleb immediately followed. The dog moved faster than usual through the storm, weaving between snowbanks while the mountain hummed around them, like distant machinery buried beneath the ice. Owen and two other workers chased behind Caleb. The eastern evacuation path eventually split near a narrow ravine where wind screamed upward through the cliffs below. Ghost stopped there and barked furiously toward the lower valley. Caleb looked down. Nothing. No cable instability. No ice movement. But Ghost remained agitated. The humming intensified sharply through the ravine walls. Echoes. The mountain sound bounced violently through the canyon, distorting direction and pressure. Caleb suddenly realized the problem. Ghost had tracked the wrong source. The dog barked again, then above them. A metallic crack echoed across the mountain. Caleb spun instantly toward the upper towers. Tower 4 swayed slightly against the storm. Too much movement. Far too much. "Move!" Caleb shouted. The maintenance workers sprinted uphill with him through the snow. Ghost followed immediately now, confusion visible even in the dog's posture. His ears flattened slightly, while he kept glancing back toward the ravine, as if struggling to understand the conflicting vibrations. Caleb reached the upper line breathless. The emergency stabilizers near Tower 4 had partially frozen. Another few hours of pressure could shear the support joints completely. Owen stared upward with pale, frightened eyes. "That tower shouldn't move like that." "No," Caleb said quietly. "It shouldn't." The realization settled heavily inside him now. Ghost was extraordinary, but not supernatural. The mountain could fool him too. One wrong decision during a real evacuation, and people would die following the wrong signal. For the first time since arriving at Black Veil, Caleb felt genuine fear. Not fear of the mountain, fear of being responsible again. The storm worsened by evening. Visibility collapsed almost completely, while heavy ice formed along the cable line faster than maintenance crews could remove it. Several workers requested permission to leave the mountain before roads closed entirely, but corporate management refused. Tomorrow morning, Daniel Voss himself was arriving with legal representatives and demolition contractors. Officially, they claimed the crews were conducting infrastructure replacement. Mason knew the truth immediately. He's cleaning the mountain. Caleb looked over from the control desk. Mason's tired face had gone pale again beneath the flickering monitor lights. The cameras, the underground files, the radio archives. His voice lowered. Everything connected to the collapse. Ghost lifted his head sharply. Outside, headlights appeared through the storm below. Multiple vehicles climbing toward the station. Too early. Caleb moved toward the windows. 5 snowcats crawled slowly through the blizzard, carrying heavy equipment and armed security personnel. At the center rode a black tracked transport vehicle larger than the others. Daniel Voss had arrived ahead of schedule. Even through layers of snow and distance, Caleb recognized him immediately from old photographs inside the archived reports. Daniel Voss looked older now, somewhere in his late 60s, but still carried the polished appearance of a man who spent his life controlling rooms before speaking inside them. Silver hair remained neatly combed despite the weather, while expensive dark winter clothing hung perfectly fitted across his tall, narrow frame. But his face looked different than Caleb expected. Not arrogant, haunted. The kind of haunted built over years rather than nights. Daniel stepped from the transport vehicle slowly, while armed contractors unloaded crates of demolition tools near the lower station. Ghost's growl deepened instantly. Mason stared toward the windows like a man seeing death approach through the snow. "He came himself," he whispered. Caleb watched workers carrying fuel cans and cutting equipment toward the underground maintenance entrance. Not repair crews, destruction crews. Daniel Voss intended to erase Black Veil Mountain permanently before reopening it. Every camera, every report, every hidden piece of truth buried beneath the snow for 11 years. Then Daniel suddenly stopped walking outside. Slowly. He looked upward toward the control room windows, directly at Caleb. Even through the storm, Caleb somehow knew the old man already understood everything. The mountain had finally chosen sides, and Black Veil was running out of time. By midnight, Black Veil Mountain no longer sounded like a mountain. It sounded alive. Wind screamed through the cliffs with enough force to shake steel supports, while snow hammered the upper ridges in violent waves that erased entire sections of the cable line from view. The storm swallowed the mountain whole beneath rotating walls of white and black shadow, and beneath it all, the cables sang, not softly anymore. The sound rolled through the storm like metal crying out beneath unbearable pressure. Deep harmonic vibrations echoed from tower to tower, rising and falling with every blast of wind. The noise moved through the mountain itself, vibrating through concrete floors and frozen support beams like something trapped beneath the ice trying desperately to warn whoever still remained alive enough to listen. Ghost heard it first. The German Shepherd suddenly sprang upright inside the control room, his black and yellow fur bristling violently along his neck. His ears locked toward the upper ridge. Then he ran. "Ghost!" Caleb Turner followed immediately. The moment he stepped outside, freezing wind slammed into him hard enough to steal his breath. Snow whipped across the station yard in blinding sheets while floodlights flickered violently against the storm. Down below, workers shouted near the maintenance vehicles. Above them, the cable line groaned like a dying bridge. Ghost sprinted uphill through the snow. Not confused this time. Focused. Certain. Caleb listened carefully while climbing after him. Then he heard it too. The vibration had changed. The harmonic rhythm beneath the line was no longer cycling evenly between the towers. One section had gone hollow. A dead resonance. His stomach tightened instantly. Loss of load stability. Tower 4 was beginning to fail. "Everybody off the upper line!" Caleb shouted into the wind. Nobody moved at first. Most of the contractors still believed the storm was only another bad Wyoming blizzard. Men continued hauling equipment crates near the underground maintenance tunnels, while Daniel Voss's security team loaded sealed archive boxes into transport vehicles. Ghost barked furiously near the upper platform. Then a metallic crack echoed through the mountain. Loud, sharp. Every worker froze. Caleb reached the upper emergency controls breathless and immediately started flipping manual override switches. His green and black plaid flannel jacket was already soaked with snow, while ice clung to his beard and hair. The system monitors flickered violently. Main load tension spiked red across Tower 4. The mountain was beginning to tear itself apart. Owen Pierce rushed into the station behind him. The younger maintenance worker looked pale beneath the emergency lights, his blonde hair soaked with melted snow and his gloves shaking from cold and fear. "What the hell is happening?" Caleb pointed toward the monitors. "The support harmonics are collapsing." Owen stared at the numbers. "That tower's gonna shear." "Yeah." Ghost suddenly growled toward the secondary brake system panel. Caleb looked immediately. Emergency brake pressure was dropping. Ice damage. If Tower 4 failed before the backup brakes locked properly, multiple active cabins could slide straight down the mountain, including the evacuation transport Daniel Voss had just boarded. Outside, engines roared as security teams prepared to leave. Daniel Voss emerged through the storm surrounded by contractors carrying archive cases toward the final operational cabin near the upper ridge. Even in chaos, the old man still carried himself with cold control. His expensive black winter coat snapped violently in the wind, while silver hair whipped loose around his lined face. But fear finally showed in his eyes now. Not fear for the workers. Fear of losing control. Ghost barked again. The mountain answered with another scream of twisting steel. Then Tower 4 shifted visibly against the storm. Workers panicked instantly. Caleb grabbed the rescue radio. "Everybody evacuate the upper platforms now! Move!" Static exploded through the speakers. Several workers ran immediately. Others froze. The storm had become too loud to think clearly. Owen sprinted toward the lower maintenance crews, dragging people away from the cable supports, while Ghost raced along the upper ridge, barking furiously at anyone still near the line. Caleb ripped open the secondary control panels with a screwdriver and flashlight clenched between his teeth. The emergency brakes were partially frozen shut. If he rerouted enough power from the underground generators, he could still stabilize the line temporarily. But only temporarily. The mountain groaned again beneath them. This time Caleb felt the vibration directly through the floor. Not long now. Mason appeared beside the control desk suddenly, breathing hard after climbing through the storm. His gray beard and coat were coated white with snow, while panic burned visibly across his exhausted face. "He's taking the archive boxes," Mason shouted. Caleb kept working. "I know. If Daniel gets off this mountain, everything disappears again." Another metallic crack thundered overhead. Ghost burst back into the control room, barking wildly. Then Caleb saw it on the monitor. Daniel's evacuation cabin had already left the upper station, moving directly toward Tower 4. Caleb cursed under his breath. The cabin swayed violently against the storm, while steel cables screamed above the cliffs. Inside the cabin, Daniel Voss sat alone beside the archive cases. Running. Even now. Caleb grabbed the radio microphone. "Voss, stop the cabin now." Only static answered. Then suddenly, Daniel's voice crackled through the speakers. Calm. Tired. Older than before. "You sound just like Ethan." Caleb froze. The storm roared around them. "You knew?" Caleb asked quietly. Static hissed. Then Daniel answered. "Yes." No denial, no excuse. Only exhaustion. Mason stared at the radio like a man hearing a ghost confess from the grave. Daniel continued speaking through broken interference while the cabin crawled slowly across the mountain. "Mason warned me the line could fail." His breathing sounded uneven now. "But shutting down before Christmas would have destroyed the company." The cables shrieked violently overhead. "I thought..." Daniel's voice cracked for the first time. "I thought we only needed a few more minutes." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Outside, Ghost howled toward the storm. Daniel spoke again. "Ethan found the reports. He wanted to stop the launch himself." Silence filled the radio for several seconds. He looked at me like I was a stranger that night. The cabin jolted violently against the line. One of the support arms bent sharply. Tower 4 was failing faster now. Caleb looked down at the emergency power readings. One choice remained. He could reroute the final reserve generators toward the secondary brake system and lock the remaining line long enough for every maintenance crew to escape. Or he could keep power flowing to Daniel's cabin and try pulling the old man across before Tower 4 collapsed. Not enough energy for both. Owen burst back into the station. "Most crews are clear." "Most?" "2 guys still below Tower 3. Ghost barked sharply again. Caleb stared at the monitors. Daniel's cabin swayed directly beside Tower 4 now. The old man's breathing returned through the radio. Very quiet. "Do it," Daniel whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. Outside, the mountains screamed. He made the decision instantly. Caleb slammed the emergency transfer switch downward. Power diverted away from Daniel's cabin. Every remaining watt surged toward the secondary brake locks. The line violently jerked as emergency clamps snapped shut across the mountain. Daniel's cabin lost momentum immediately. For one brief moment, it hung suspended beside Tower 4. Then the main support cable snapped. The sound exploded through Black Veil Mountain, like thunder tearing open the sky. Ghost lunged backward instinctively as steel whipped violently across the cliffs. Daniel's cabin disappeared into the white storm below. Several workers screamed. Then Tower 4 finally gave way. The massive steel structure twisted once against the blizzard before collapsing into the ravine beneath an avalanche of snow and shattered ice. The mountain shook hard enough to knock Caleb against the control desk. Silence followed. Not true silence. Only wind. Only storm. Only the dying hum of loose cables swaying above the cliffs. Caleb slowly looked toward the evacuation monitors. Every maintenance crew marker still moved. Alive. Owen stared at the screens in disbelief. Nobody else went down. Ghost walked slowly toward Caleb through the flickering lights and pressed against his leg. The German shepherd's breathing remained fast but steady now. Outside, Black Veil Mountain continued disappearing beneath the blizzard. But for the first time in 11 years, the mountain had taken no new lives. The story spread across America within 48 hours. At first, it appeared only in small regional news reports. A catastrophic structural collapse prevented by a former Army engineer and his German Shepherd rescue dog during one of Wyoming's worst winter storms. Then journalists uncovered the archived reports, the deleted footage, the testimony from surviving workers, and finally Daniel Voss's confession recorded through emergency rescue frequencies during the collapse itself. After that, Black Veil Mountain stopped being a forgotten local tragedy. It became national news. Television crews arrived before the roads fully reopened. Reporters stood beside frozen barricades beneath the shattered remains of Tower 4, while helicopters circled above the mountain, searching for footage of the destroyed cable line buried beneath snow and twisted steel. Caleb Turner hated every second of it. The former soldier spent most interviews avoiding cameras whenever possible. At 48 years old, Caleb still carried the quiet heaviness of a man more comfortable repairing broken machinery than speaking publicly. His broad shoulders and rough hands belonged to years of physical labor and military engineering work, not headlines. The green and black plaid flannel jacket had become permanently associated with Black Veil now because nearly every photograph captured him wearing it beside the mountain. Ghost received more attention than Caleb did. The German Shepherd became famous almost overnight. People online called him the dog who heard the mountain. Children mailed drawings of him from all over the country. Rescue organizations requested appearances. News anchors repeated stories about how Ghost detected the harmonic vibrations before the final collapse. Ghost ignored all of it. The black and yellow dog still spent most mornings lying quietly near the old control station windows, ears occasionally lifting toward the wind outside while snow drifted softly across the mountain. But the mountain sounded different now. Quieter. 3 weeks after the collapse, Daniel Voss regained consciousness in a hospital in Cheyenne. He had survived the fall. Barely. The rescue teams found the wreckage of his cabin buried beneath avalanche debris nearly half a mile below Tower 4. Both legs were shattered. Several ribs broken. Frostbite damaged part of his left hand permanently. But he lived. Federal investigators arrested him directly from the hospital room. Photographs spread across every news station in the country showed Daniel being wheeled through the hospital corridor in handcuffs beneath bright camera flashes. His once perfect silver hair looked thinner now. His narrow face had aged 20 years within a month. The polished businessman who spent decades protecting Black Veil's reputation had vanished completely. Only guilt remained. Families of the victims finally learned the truth. Not rumors, not edited reports, truth. The memorial service happened in early spring after the roads became safe enough for travel again. Snow still covered much of the mountain, but sunlight finally reached the valleys longer each afternoon. The memorial stood near the frozen lake below the old resort entrance. 8 granite markers faced the mountain ridge where the original cable line once crossed through the storm. Hundreds of people attended. Caleb remained near the back beside Ghost. He recognized many faces now. Owen Pierce stood with several maintenance workers near the front rows. Agnes Holloway handed warm coffee to visitors while quietly comforting families who still carried grief 11 years old. Walter Grady sat silently beneath a heavy winter coat, staring toward the broken towers above the cliffs. Then Mason Reed arrived. The entire crowd went still. For 11 years, most people believed Mason was either dead or guilty. Now they watched him walk slowly through the snow toward the memorial, carrying a weathered leather satchel against his side. Mason looked thinner than ever beneath his old gray wool coat. His beard remained uneven and silver, while deep exhaustion still hollowed his face. But something had changed in his posture. For the first time, he no longer looked like a man hiding. He stopped before the families quietly. No speech, no excuse. Only truth. One by one, Mason removed the sealed letters from his satchel. The same letters he had written over 11 winters inside the cabin hidden in the forest. His hands shook slightly as he gave each envelope to the victims' families personally. Some people cried. One older woman embraced him without saying a word. Another man refused to look at him at first, before finally accepting the letter with trembling hands. No one shouted. No one demanded revenge. The mountain had already taken enough from everyone there. Finally, Mason reached the center memorial. Slowly, he removed Ethan Voss's pocket watch from his coat. The silver casing remained scratched and frozen forever at 2:17. Mason stared at it for a long moment, then gently placed it beside Ethan's memorial stone. The wind moved softly through the valley. No singing, no metal screaming beneath the mountain. Only silence. Pastor Jeremiah Holt spoke quietly during the ceremony, while snow drifted around the memorial candles. The old pastor's white beard moved gently in the wind as he looked across the gathered families. "Some tragedies destroy places forever," he said softly. "But sometimes truth rebuilds what fear tried to bury." Caleb listened silently beside Ghost. For years, Black Veil Mountain had existed like an open wound across the town. Now, for the first time, it finally felt like healing had begun. Summer arrived slowly in Wyoming that year. Snow retreated higher into the cliffs while construction crews dismantled the remains of the old resort system piece by piece. Federal investigators shut down the luxury redevelopment project permanently after uncovering decades of financial fraud, safety violations, and hidden settlements tied to Daniel Voss's company. Most investors disappeared immediately. But Caleb stayed. So did Mason. Together they rebuilt Black Veil into something entirely different. Not a resort. Not a tourist attraction. A rescue center. The old cable station became the Black Veil Winter Response Unit, a mountain emergency shelter and alpine rescue training facility designed for blizzards, avalanches, and lost travelers stranded in dangerous conditions. The town helped constantly. Owen Pierce became lead maintenance supervisor for the new system. The young worker looked stronger now than when Caleb first met him during the storm. His nervous uncertainty had faded beneath purpose and responsibility. He redesigned the new tower supports personally, using reinforced structural materials capable of surviving even Black Veil's worst winters. Walter Grady trained younger volunteers how to operate emergency snow vehicles. Agnes Holloway turned the lower station kitchen into a permanent warming shelter, serving hot food during storms. Even Mason changed. Not completely. The sleeplessness never fully disappeared. Loud engine noises still made him tense instinctively. Sometimes Caleb still caught him staring toward Tower 4's replacement supports during heavy wind. But Mason no longer hid in the forest. He taught avalanche safety classes now. He trained younger rescue teams how to recognize dangerous harmonic shifts beneath unstable snowpacks. And slowly, people stopped seeing him as the ghost of Black Veil Mountain. They started seeing him as one of the men who saved it. 1 year after the collapse, the new cable line officially reopened. This time, the ceremony happened at sunrise. The entire town gathered beneath fresh snowfall, while pale morning light spread slowly across the mountains. The new cabins moved silently along reinforced steel lines above the valley, their glass windows glowing gold beneath the dawn. Children laughed near the boarding platform. Families carried hot chocolate and winter blankets. Music played softly through outdoor speakers, while snow drifted gently through the cold air. Life had returned to Black Veil. Caleb stood near the upper platform beside Ghost, watching the first cabins move across the mountain. Inside the cabins were children pressing excited faces against the windows, parents smiling, tourists laughing nervously at the height. No fear, no ghosts, only people living. Only, Ghost lay calmly beside Caleb's boots, his ears still lifting occasionally whenever wind brushed through the cables overhead. Instinct never disappeared completely, but the tension was gone. Caleb listened carefully toward the mountain one last time. For so long, Black Veil had sounded wounded. The cables had screamed, the towers had groaned, the mountain had sung like something broken beneath the ice. Now, nothing. Only wind, only snow, only peace. Caleb slowly unclipped the old rescue radio from his belt, the same radio that carried Ethan Voss's final warning through the storm, the same radio he carried every day since arriving at Black Veil Mountain. He stared at it quietly for several seconds, then placed it gently on the wooden bench beside the platform. No need anymore. Ghost lifted his head toward him. Caleb looked out across the snowy ridges glowing beneath sunrise. "Finally sounds at peace," he said softly. Ghost's ears twitched once toward the mountain, but the dog remained completely calm. And for the first time in 11 years, Black Veil Mountain was truly silent. Winter still returned to Black Veil Mountain every year. Snow still covered the cliffs. Wind still moved through the cable lines at night. And sometimes, when storms rolled across the valley, Caleb Turner would pause beside the station windows and listen out of instinct alone. But the mountain no longer sounded wounded. The fear that once lived inside those steel towers had faded into something quieter, something human again. Some nights, Caleb sat outside after the rescue crews had gone home, a cup of black coffee cooling slowly in his hands, while Ghost rested beside his boots, ears twitching gently at the wind. Below them, the cabins carried families safely across the snow beneath warm yellow lights. Life moving forward. And for the first time in many years, Caleb no longer felt like a man hiding from the past. He felt like someone who had finally stayed long enough to help build something that could outlive it. Ghost lifted his head once toward the mountain, then settled back into the snow peacefully. Far above them, Black Veil remained silent, and somehow, that silence no longer felt empty. If this story stayed with you for a little while after the ending, thank you for spending time here with us.